In the light of this, our next panel discussion will delve deeper into the topic and cover the renewable energy map for the MENA region. According to IRENA's market analysis 2019, in the GCC area, for instance, most renewable projects have been utility scale, with only a handful of utility scale solar projects dominating the renewable electricity capacity. When looking at the greater picture, I think that we need to ask ourselves what are the challenges and some of the opportunities to deliver on the government's ambitious targets. Now, the discussion will be led by Dr. Raed Bikeirat, whom is the Clean Energy Business Council Managing Director, a Senior Advisor at Apicum Group, and founder of Sunergy Advisory. Dr. Bikeirat has over 2 decades of experience in the energy sector, a passion for decarbonization and clean tech, mentors several tech startups, as well as is the author of numerous reference papers. Let me just welcome to the stage Dr. Bikeirat. Please, let's give him a big round of applause. And I would also like to invite as well our guest speakers, Graham Sims, the Executive Director of Dubai Electricity and Water Regulator, RSB. Graham, please join us on the stage. Dr. Amro El Shurafa, Research Fellow at King Abdullah Petroleum Studies and Research Center. Dr. Hassan Kassem, General Manager at Alternative Energy Project Company. And lastly, Les Graham, Advisor to the Chairman of Abu Dhabi's Department of Energy. Thank you very much. Over to you, Dr. Bikeirat.
Thank you, Michaela. Good morning, everyone. It's truly a pleasure to be here with you today to finally hold our annual summit for CEBC. We had yesterday our Women in Clean Energy event, and today is the main event. And at CEBC, really, we pride ourselves with being driven by content and know-how sharing. And I think so far the presentations and the ensuing panels, I think, will demonstrate that. And I hope that you're getting your dose of clean energy information. So we have, this is our first panel. The panel will be focusing on renewables in MENA, in the Middle East. We've had some excellent insights and remarks from Dr. Nasser and Gauri about the macro view on climate change and what's happening through the energy transition. And we'll try to now zoom in, looking at renewables in the Arab world or in the Middle East. So I want to give just a couple of slides, really, just to maybe set the tone for the discussion that we have. And I always like to start with the point, looking at the cumulative capacity when it comes to wind and solar PV installation. You can add CSP into that. So roughly in summer 2018, we crossed a very major milestone. So we crossed the cumulative capacity of having 1,000 gigawatts of solar and wind. And it's really an interesting point in time, because if you look at the rate of deployment that we're having right now, and I agree with IHS, there are other scenarios. I really hope that the reality will far exceed what we are predicting for everybody's sake. But we're looking at the next 1,000 gigawatt of cumulative PV and wind to happen in the next 2 to 3 years. Hopefully, by 2030, we'll be looking at maybe 3,000 to 4,000 cumulative PV gigawatts of cumulative PV and wind around the world. And we have seen, I mean, I like the word, it comes with a plus and minus. I like the word, the 1 cent kilowatt hour. We heard about the 1.7 cent announced. It's announced, it's not financial close, but I'm sure it will be in the range of 1.6, 1.7. And this 1 cent kilowatt hour, and we'll discuss that with our panelists, really can open up the door, or is opening up the door for different applications. Urbanization is a big factor, obviously. We're looking at super cities. This is happening in the region and across the world, and this is already the number of people living in big cities as opposed to rural. Already the number has crossed a few years back, around 2010, and it continues to increase. Cities will be basically consuming roughly 80% of our resources. In the Arab world, if you go back to mid-70s, you can hardly count 17 cities that have more than 1 million people living in it. Today, the number far exceeds 90, close to 100. And you can see a massive growth in number of people living in cities in the Arab world. Obviously, we're driven by heavy growth in demand in power and water. The cumulative average growth rate in some countries, especially in the GCC, was double-digit. It slowed down in the last few years, but it continues to grow. And that puts pressure, obviously, be it for power generation or for water consumption, desalination on our primary energy usage. So really, I want to just give highlights, and I'll try to focus a little bit on Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia has a doubling effect. The numbers, they keep getting updated. I don't think they will reach 120 gigawatt of peak load demand by 2030, but they're expecting somewhere close to 100, which requires generation capacity of maybe 20% above that. And now there is an overlay of renewables being developed, which we'll go through. In terms of share, this is maybe a couple of years old, but the percentage hasn't changed. You can see the volume of clean energy in the Arab world increasing, but as a total percentage, really, it doesn't amount to much as we stand today. A lot of it is hydro. We are bringing online now, every couple of months, projects of the size of several hundred megawatts, maybe a gigawatt, and that percentage will improve. And we've seen from Gauri and Dr. Nasser, there are targets for every country in the region. These targets are being revised, and there is a varied level of success for the countries trying to reach their assigned targets. And there are several active projects that we'll discuss maybe today that are happening across the region. The region continues to attract large investments, break records in terms of size and tariffs. And Saudi Arabia. The Saudi market is really the jewel of the crown, if you will, in terms of renewables, as we all know. And today, we have a renewed emphasis, if you will, on a country level to push forward a very ambitious plan for renewables. And there is a program driven by, which is part of what's called the National Renewable Energy Program, NREP, part of Vision 2030. That's executed by the Renewable Energy Project Development Office, and it focuses on solar PV, wind, and CSP. And the targets have been continuously revised. Today, Saudi Arabia aims to install about 58.7 gigawatts of renewables by 2030, and that's driven by 40 gigawatts of PV, 16 gigawatts of wind, and 2.7 gigawatts of CSP. And the program will be executed through two main entities. One is REPDO, which is the Office for Renewable Project Development under the Ministry of Energy, what is now called the Ministry of Energy. And the other arm is the Public Investment Fund. And the split there is 30-70%. The tenders for REPDO are driven by auctions, and PIF will be direct negotiations. And obviously, proving credibility is very important. Saudi Arabia has a history of big announcements and delays in execution, but I think it's fair to say, and I've been part of it since a decade, pretty much, and I will be the first one to say that it's actually happening. There are, today, there are 12 projects under tendering phase, round 2, which has 6 projects. Al-Faisaliya, 600 megawatt is one example, Rafah, Medina. These are due in January, and total round 2 is roughly 1,500 megawatts of projects, and round 3 will be announced for qualification in the next 2 or 3 weeks. And the team in Saudi Arabia with REPDO and PIF is really under pressure to really keep rolling out these projects. So as we stand today, there is roughly 3 gigawatts of projects under tendering in Saudi Arabia between solar PV and wind. One important point, and again, I really just want to focus a little bit on the Saudi market, but I think it's important. And this is a map of the solar and wind parks that are planned. The sites are announced. The capacities vary. Obviously, developing land in a country like Saudi Arabia, acquiring land and doing the permitting and the approval is not a simple process. This is why the government is stepping in to manage that for the private sector. But you can see a lot of it is on the west and northwest side where there's ample resources of wind and solar irradiance. And there are, round one is under construction, and Sakaka, it had two projects. One is solar PV, Sakaka PV, and one is wind. Sakaka achieved a tariff of 2.34 cents. And it's currently under construction with planned commercial operating date, I think, in the next couple of months. And the other project is Dumatil Jandal, which actually received a lot of analysis, I would say. The announced tariff was 2.1 cent per kilowatt hour. The site doesn't have amazing resource of wind. It's average speed of roughly 7 meters per second. And yet, this is a record for wind projects. And financial close actually was even lower. Financial close was 1.99, I think, cent per kilowatt hour. So it's a great start for a massive market, and there are already developers, companies that have grown in the UAE already moving and looking at the Saudi market. So with that, I just want to give a quick brief. I would like to move on to our panelists. Maybe to start, maybe we can start by just giving maybe a quick description about the organization that you represent, and maybe talk a little bit about the status of the market when it comes to renewables that you represent. Maybe Les, you want to start? Talk about DOE?
Yep, well, Department of Energy Abu Dhabi is the policymaker and regulator for the Emirate of Abu Dhabi in the energy space. So obviously power and water are an important part of that. And the future generation projects, decoupling of power from water through RO, bringing solar power onto the system. These are important objectives that we have for Abu Dhabi.
Alternative Energy Project is, I would say, a developer focused more into the CNI market. As of now, we have a total capacity of 550 megawatt split around the MENA region, where we have with a pipeline that about for the next 2 years with about half of that capacity as well. EPICO, Alternative Energy Projects, is actually a subsidiary of Kuwait Project Company Holding, which is actually a big financial institute in Kuwait, composed mostly of banks and insurance companies. That's just a quick wrap-up of who we are. Thank you.
Good morning. Thank you, Dr. Raed, for the invitation. I work for King Abdullah Petroleum Center for Research and Studies, King Abdullah Petroleum Studies and Research Center, better known as CAPSARC. CAPSARC is based in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia, and is an independent research think tank. We have approximately 70 researchers coming from 20 countries, and we focus on energy-related research. Be it power modeling, macroeconomics, climate change, transportation, mobility, and political and decision sciences. So we cover generally most of the spectrum that is related to energy matters.
Good morning. The RSB is Dubai's power and water regulatory body, and of most relevance to this panel discussion is that we're the licensing body for Dubai's independent power projects, all of which by one have so far been renewable in nature. And our other responsibilities, which we will probably touch on less in this panel, relate to implementing aspects of Dubai's demand-side management strategy.
Thank you. So to start, maybe I would like to bring up a couple of points, and this is open for panelists to really interact on the topics that are being discussed. Amro, CAPSARC is a renowned think tank in the region. You're involved in very important topics such as the energy mix in a market like Saudi Arabia. When it comes to policy planning and recommendations on things like the energy mix, modeling comes as a strong tool to try to present to policymakers what-if scenarios, projections. We've seen from IHS one scenario or different scenarios on what's going to happen in terms of fuel mix and usage and so on. Modeling can be a topic of debate. I mean, we see projection from IHS, from Bloomberg, from DNVGL, and they vary in some areas, and they more or less coincide in other areas, and they're all independently logical. How do you see modeling playing a role? Is it worth the effort? Is this the only tool we should use for developing scenarios on future energy mixes?
The power sector has transformed. Previously, the power sector was a sector that meets demand. Currently, the power sector is a political stability provider, is a hub for economic growth, is central for political stability, economic growth, and industry growth as well. If you look at textbooks, if you look at universities, you'll find that the power sector hasn't necessarily developed much over many, many years. This transformed in the past 10, 20 years. Advent of renewables, computing power, smart meters, distribution network, renewables, they really revived the power sector. And to answer your question very quickly, do you think that do we need modeling? Do we need mathematical representations of policy, macro policies and power policies? I think the answer is yes. Two reasons for that. Number one, the power sector in the MENA region, and let's focus on the MENA region, is becoming bigger. And you could have probably in the past gotten away with a simple linear program, with a simple fancy Excel sheet. But the power sector is becoming very, very big. And although the basic calculations that govern the power sector are simple, but when you have so many of these calculations, you need a mathematical representation for it. Another extremely important transformation in the power sector is the complexity of what we're seeing right now in terms of operation. You're having stochasticity in solar, you're having stochasticity in the wind sector, and the stochasticity in wind and solar are very different. You're having the duck curve to deal with, you have ramping to deal with, and then the moment you talk about the transmission sector, the problem becomes extremely difficult. Global leading modelers like Ben Hobbs and Dave Daniels, they have shown actually that in many cases, the classical approach was generation first, transmission second. So you tell me what the demand is, I'll tell you what the generation mix is. With renewables, this doesn't necessarily work anymore. You have to consider transmission simultaneously with generation. And it has been shown, this is probably something interesting, that in many cases, you only need to update or upgrade your network, your transmission network, and not even touch the generation mix to get the least cost option. And there's just no way to deal with that without an actual mathematical representation. You add the third layer of complexity, which is markets. If you have a market, you have dispatch priorities for some IPPs, you have fuel contracts, that skews your merit order. You have game theory. I mean, the problem explodes. So I think, yes, there is no other way that we currently know where we can actually extract insights without a mathematical representation. And I will conclude by saying I'm not overinflating the value of mathematical models or quantum numerical representations of the power sector. Models will not be able to fully and completely answer every single energy policy question. But every policy question should have a qualitative description supported by some numerical quantification.
Well said, well said. Just to build on that, we're seeing tariffs that are below 2 cents, and everyone is using at least, sometimes it's not apples to apples, people refer to levelized cost of energy as the benchmark. As we have more and more depth of penetration of renewables onto the grid, is really LCOE is the only, is the proper benchmark to compare, or can you elaborate a little bit on that?
Yes, so the levelized cost of energy or the levelized cost of electricity, this is one of the best, most widely used accepted metrics in the energy industry. It's simple, it's nice, it rolls off your tongue. Every, Lazard has an annual outlook, IHS, BNF, IRENA, everybody talks about LCOE. It does have its benefits. It gives you an indicative metric to compare different technologies. However, this is just the starting point. The moment you get into the system, the moment you integrate renewables into your power system, the LCOE just is not capable anymore of giving you any insights, not at all. When you integrate renewables, your reserve requirements change, your avoided fuels change, your dispatch changes. Although it gave you a reasonable indication to compare the technologies at the very beginning of your portfolio, just categorizing your portfolio. But after that, there's no way that you can compare the system costs with the LCOE. Integration costs become an issue, avoided fuels become an issue, cost of intermittency become an issue, your reliability becomes an issue, and the LCOE does not capture any of these details, any of these operational minutiae within the power sector. You have other metrics. You have your nodal pricing, you have your short-run marginal cost, long-run marginal cost, your average cost. You have more complicated, sophisticated methodologies and metrics to better describe the financial implications of renewables entering into the market. So, just to be fair, it is a reasonable metric for some aspects of your policy decision-making, but it should not in any way be the only one. And I will conclude by saying it may be a good metric for a single project satisfying a single factory or a single company, but when you integrate renewables within the system, using the LCOE is extremely dangerous.
So we're looking at it from system integration costs. So if we take the DO900, for example, at 1.7 cent, a standalone project, that levelized cost is 1.7 cent. But the true system cost of adding that energy into the grid in that location has another adder. It could be plus or minus. It could be a negative point.
Precisely.
Yeah.
It could actually end up, you might end up having a higher average cost for the whole system if you integrate renewables, despite the fact that on its own it might be cheaper.
Speaking of that, this region is looking at gigawatt projects. Abu Dhabi has rolled one of the early markets that pushed the gigawatt projects. Wuhan was 1.1, 1.2 gigawatt. And now we have more renewables coming online. And let's stay with the topic of integrating large-scale projects to the grid. How do you see that happening in Abu Dhabi? And is that something more specific for the network and the landscape, the size of Abu Dhabi? And do you see that changing in the future?
Well, I think it's a problem for the whole energy system. And, you know, with regards to Dr. Nasser's comments at the beginning, I would like to encourage him that I think in 10 years, we will all do a lot more solar than we almost imagine we will do today. Because the value of these projects is compelling. I mean, what we saw with Sweihan was that people want to invest in these green energy projects. So there's debt out there actually looking for them. The cost of funding is extremely low at the minute, and the capex is also falling. So it gives us an opportunity at the moment to do these large projects. But they do come with challenges, and I had some charts that maybe we could just flip up.
Can you put the slides for less?
Because I think if you can go to the next slide, these illustrate some of the points that Dr. Amro was talking about. So here you can see the typical peak demand in this is taken from Abu Dhabi data, but it's similar for most of the power systems of the GCC countries. And if we go on to when we have a large volume of solar, it really impacts the rest of the generation. So the red line is the net demand net of solar. Now, what does that do? It forces our effectively mostly CCGT and OCGT to pick up that flexibility. And you can see the ramp rates that Dr. Amro referred to. In the morning, we have to take a lot of generation off the system. And from noon onwards, we have to bring a lot of that onto the system. Now, there's a challenge there because many of these plants are also producing desalinated water. So there's a limit to how fast we can bring them off the system and bring them back on again. So, for example, this is the kind of ramp rate effect that you see where perhaps we're bringing 10% of our total system capacity onto and off the system every hour through the middle of the day. So in the morning it's falling off, and in the afternoon you have to bring it back on again. And then you think about, you know, is that physically possible? Do we have some limitations? Well, as I mentioned, because of desalination, it's difficult to just bring these units off the system. So that will require some curtailment, which is the area between the two red lines. In the afternoon, we actually have to look forward to our peak demand to understand what that is, and begin actually from perhaps before midday to bring units back onto the system to be able to meet that peak demand because of the limitations on the ramp rates. And then we have another problem, which is that our systems have not been designed for these kinds of technologies that are DC connected through inverters. And so we lose the inertia of the spinning units, the turbines on the system. And until we adapt our grid codes, we're stuck with very high levels of inertia requirements, which again will cause curtailment of large quantities of PV. So under these lines, if you add those up, this is the kind of curtailment you have with PV in large volumes on the peak day in the summer. Of course, in the winter, it's much worse. Now, it's not all bad news, because we can get value from some of this curtailed solar. We don't have to effectively turn it off. So some of the challenges we have that we have to begin to address are we have to adapt our grid codes to build in the capacity to have more flexibility in frequency. We need to look forward 10 years or 15 years, not planning for what we'll have in 2 or 3 years, but looking to the long-term future. You can't do this, these significant changes every 2 or 3 years. You have to think long-term. We have to focus on enhanced flexibility of our thermal generation fleet. These units have been built to run continuously. I mean, I've commissioned units that once they were commissioned, we didn't even turn them off. We ran them for another 6 months before shutting them down in Saudi Arabia. We have to look at how do we get shorter startup times, lowered gas turbine minimum loads, open cycle operation. How do we increase the ramp rates of individual units? And one actually that I haven't put here because it's assumed now for Abu Dhabi, which is decoupling of desalination from the power system and building RO. Then we have to look at the grid services. So if we go back, under this yellow curve, we have value that we can get from PV with accurate generation forecasting, which we don't have as yet. We can get AGC, we can get reserves, we can get synthetic inertia, and allow the PV to respond to the needs of the system. And then there's the demand side. So we have time of use, which needs to give consumers the right signals about when to use this energy. Anytime you see this yellow curve, the marginal value of the energy you're producing anywhere on the system is 0. So we need to shift demand back into those yellow hours. We need to look at EV smart charging. We need to look at demand response, load shifting. Water heating in particular is one that perhaps in the region we can look at. We need to look at embedded storage and how we use that. And of course, this needs policies and regulation, because we don't want people just putting together smart networks. We hear a lot about smart networks, but until we know what those smart networks have to do for us and the problems they have to solve, then we might find that we haven't specified the correct functionality. They need to be able to talk to our devices. Distribution needs to be able to interface to transmission. So we have a lot of challenges, but we are not pioneers in this. Other countries with high proportions of intermittent PV and wind with a lot of inverter connected capacity are already solving these problems. So as we come to this new era, we can learn the lessons that others have learned elsewhere, and in fact, we can learn them much more quickly and avoid some of the mistakes that they have made. But again, just to tie into what Dr. Amro has said, IEA has coined the term value-adjusted LCOE, because LCOE is useful for comparing different proposals for the same project. These solar projects are going to drive cost into our systems, and we need to consider the costs at which we're willing to contract for these new capacities, and how we will compensate for that by increasing the flexibility, investing in these new technologies, which is where the value adjustment comes in.
Thank you. I don't want to dwell too much, but although it's a very important topic, with utility scale renewables, I mean, we're talking about variable generation being added to a rigid grid. And really, it's adding firming on the renewable side, while you add flexibility on the grid side is the proper solution. And now I think the issue is being addressed. There are different solutions. And it's from an economic standpoint, with $1+ per kilowatt hour and the cost of storage, for example, on the system level dropping below $300 US per kilowatt hour, I think that flexibility, that synthetic spinning reserve, inertia will be dealt with. And also we have other applications. I mean, at 1 cent per kilowatt hour, solar doesn't, and wind doesn't have to be only for power generation. It could be for hydrogen, green hydrogen generation, desalination, and so on. You can do so much with cheap, clean energy that will open up new frontiers. I want to now move and pivot a little bit, maybe talk about distributed generation. And maybe to start with that, I can bring in Hassan, Graham. Hassan, Kuwait has a peak load demand of what, 12 gigawatts roughly? Somewhere in the range, or maybe less. Kuwait has pushed a program for solar rooftops behind the meter on government buildings. There are discussions on ESCOs. At the same time, Kuwait is doing what similar to what Dubai is doing. They took a solar park, and there is the Dibdaba project at over 1 gigawatt, and there are other in the gigawatt scale projects. How do you see the value? I mean, utility scale we've talked about, but how do you see distributed generation program happening in Kuwait, and is it going to expand?
All right. Well, usually distributed market, a healthy distributed market comes as a secondary market after a policy initiation and in the country. That's a healthy distributed market. And I mean, you can see this trend happening everywhere here. You have utility scale project, IPPs, PPPs projects out, and then as part of the initiation of typical net metering or other kind of scheme, you have a distributed market enabled in the market. So in a sense, it's an initiation of a secondary market. Unfortunately, in Kuwait, due to the tariff subsidy and the institutional structure of the country, no clear policy has been set. Saying that, nevertheless, the government is still committed to the target they set themselves to by 2030, which is 15%. And that led them to be able, or they led them to push, to initiate programs to try and cover for that. What they've noticed is, even though Kuwait actually have a clear PPP scheme, which is actually handling all the utility scale deployment, they already announced a total of 3 gigawatt to be released by next year through the PPP scheme under 5 projects. Nevertheless, the requirement for distributed market is still needed. As of now, these distributed projects has been mainly initiated by the government. So they already released few projects. One of them was 50 houses, then it's increased to 150 houses, which is a fully distributed scheme managed by the government, sponsored by the government as well. And now they have upscaled it to 1,500 houses. In addition to that, they already announced that all government projects that are being developed now has to have a minimum of 10% of their expected load to be covered by renewables. And this is a mandate that's it's been going on. And basically, the last one is what is driving the distributed market in Kuwait. So it's not really a scheme or a cost-driven market as much as government trying to cover up for requirement and demand in that segment.
Graham, Shams Dubai is really the first program in the region, the GCC, for behind-the-meter net metering scheme. What are the views on the program so far, the progress achieved so far, and how do you see it expanding in Dubai?
Well, when the program was established, the decision was taken to have a net metering program rather than a feed-in tariff, and there was a long debate about that. And when first launched, it was probably a marginal case for many customers, given the cost of PV at the time, even if they were paying the highest slab rate in Dubai. But of course, tariffs in Dubai have stayed constant since the Shams Dubai program was introduced, and solar PV costs have come down dramatically. And inevitably, we're seeing a real acceleration in the number of projects. The likelihood is it will remain a relatively small contributor to total PV deployment by, say, 2030, compared to the utility scale. But I guess that's based on a current view of costs. I also think that at some point, some of the issues that Les identified in relation to the integration of transmission system level renewables will need to start to be asked about what is the right approach to deploying rooftop solar. If you have a customer who could credibly meet all of their demand through PV, if they had a large enough site relative to their demand, in theory they would pay net, not a single fill to DEWA over the course of a year. But the grid is always there. The grid is certainly there at night time when their PV panels are no longer producing. And the grid is certainly there when their PV panels stop producing because of sandstorm or other. So I think we'll get to the point, and I think this needs to be thought about sooner rather than later, about how we should best incentivize rooftop solar. So the system integration costs, which we've talked about, are also taken into account at that level. That said, I'm a fan of rooftop solar because I think it brings some other benefits with it, that it starts to get the individual business or householder thinking a little bit more about their energy use because they're supplying some of that themselves. They maybe start to think about, well, I have a kilowatt hour here, I could use that, either I could use that just to run my washing machine, or maybe I should be thinking about how that could be used on the grid. So I'm certainly not suggesting there should be some reduction in support for rooftop solar, but increasingly as it becomes important, you'll need to think about how costs of the grid shared amongst people who have rooftop solar and those who don't.
How do you see the program reaching? I mean, Dubai has 7% target by 2020 of clean energy. How do you see, right now we're at, I think Attire announced we're at 150 megawatts of installed, or somewhere in the range of distributed solar.
Something like that, yeah.
How do you see that ramping up to what, a gigawatt in the next 5 years? Or?
I think that might be at the outer edge. Gigawatt by 2030, I think, is plausible, but that would be a gigawatt against the current plan of something like 5 gigawatts of utility scale. So that, hence my point about it would be roughly a sixth of the total solar deployment.
I think DG is often really an undermined topic. I mean, DG has a much bigger socioeconomic impact on the total grid, from an end user behavior, from an ownership, job creation. Job creation in DG is 20 times what utility scale projects bring, and it's often really undermined. I mean, DG is being discussed as a hot topic in Saudi Arabia, and there's always a debate with the policymakers, politicians, is it worth it, not worth it? And we always go back to the 1 cent as the worth or no worth, although there is a lot of economic value add that you can discuss. I mean, 1 cent of clean energy coming out on the grid is really an LCOE standalone cost. If you add to it the system integration impact, add to it the potential lost opportunity of creating a market, attracting developers, manufacturers, this could be 1.5 or 2.5 cents. And I think often policymakers and regulators don't see that. They just are stuck on the size and the tariff. Storage, is there a discussion in Dubai on regulating residential, like low voltage integration of storage on the grid? Can I put a power wall on my house, for example?
Yeah, well, I mean, this is the current approach to rooftop solar makes storage, a nonsense, because the storage is provided by the grid. So that would require, if there was a serious move to have localized storage, you would need to, in some way, fairly dramatically reform the net metering scheme, I think. which I guess is why I say, within the next few years, there will need to be a much more thorough examination of what is the right balance of utility scale versus locally deployed. To what extent we're going to use pricing signals to get these changes, or other forms of regulation. But I expect storage will become economic in terms of its overall costs relative to the cost of supply. But then the question will be, how does that stack up against the actual price signals that people face?
Are there any plans for time of day rates part of the sorry, I had to ask. I mean, it's just
no, and I'm only sort of smiling because there was a plan to look at time of use, and that, of course, was back in roughly 2013 when the demand-side management strategy was first created. And of course, at that time, what people really meant was trying to shift demand away from the daytime. And now people have realized we're potentially very soon in the opposite situation where, as demonstrated by Les's slides, we'll be saying to people, please turn on your washing machine and dishwasher at 2 p.m. Instead of at the moment, they're encouraged by DEWA during the summer. So I think there will still need to be something around time of use, but it's going to be, frankly, the complete reversal of what people used to mean by time of use until large-scale solar came on board. But it's hard to see how we'll get full economic exploitation of these technologies if we don't reform the way we price electricity.
Les, is there any discussion for storage regulatory framework in Abu Dhabi, be it on there is a program to integrate storage, I think, utility scale. And is that being discussed on the low voltage, on the distribution grid?
So there's the option for bidders for the PV2 project at Al Dhafra, which is a 1,500 megawatts AC project to offer storage. Depending on the weighting factors, that may offer the lowest LCOE for the project, but as I mentioned before, LCOE is sometimes a little bit deceiving. We see storage being useful for grid services before it is for energy shifting. And the costs of storage are just too high at the moment for demand shifting. So, and you see this throughout the world, apart from some very few isolated cases like South Australia, where they have some particular problems, storage is providing grid services. That's what we see as the first market for it in Abu Dhabi, in the region. And as the cost curve develops, I can see in 10 years we'll be beginning to look at standalone energy storage projects being viable and competitive to be able to offer a service to the system, which allows some of this cheap PV to be admitted, stored, and then sent out again later on. But really, until the cost curve comes down, if we had, the time of use signals, we might see some domestic storage. And I think time of use signals will have to come to consumers in order to allow us to benefit from the solar revolution. And in time, then, consumers may have a signal to put in some energy storage, particularly if they have rooftop PV, and they could avoid the peak demand times, say from 7 in the evening till 10 in the evening.
Can you just elaborate a little bit more? The current tender for 1.5 gig AC has an option for storage. Can you elaborate a little bit? Is there a time window? What kind of an option is being
Yes, there's an option for a few hundred megawatt hours of storage, around about up to an hour of energy storage. Not an hour for the full energy of the project, but it could discharge after 1 hour. So it's been put into the bid on an energy basis. Perhaps the system operator would like to be able to use that in a more flexible way to support the intermittency of solar, because some of the lessons we've learned with these very large solar projects, single-site solar projects, is that you can lose 60, 70, 80% of the generation within minutes, particularly on spring days or if you have a dust storm. So something has to compensate for that. But you can't put in 1,500 megawatts of storage into a solar project without raising the true LCOE to about probably 15, 20 cents per kilowatt hour.
True, and I think the topic of regulating storage on the distribution grid is going to come sooner than later. I mean, look at the penetration of EVs and batteries on wheels, and you have an opportunity when we talk about vehicle to grid and so on. I mean, batteries are entering homes anyway, whether we like it or not, and trying to address that.
And for that, we need smart grids, and we need the right time of use signals for consumers, and we also need effectively intermediaries who will offer the consumer an energy service which handles all of this for them so that they don't have to think about when they plug in their EV, when their washing machine starts, when their refrigeration compressor deloads for 3 minutes because there's a problem on the network.
Yeah. Now with distributed generation, it's been mainly net metering, behind the meter, with no support. I mean, there are no discussions around feed-in tariff. There is not really any support from the government. And I think the market is evolving really just from learning curve and the drop in costs in systems and so on. There are models that allow for wider market segments if we go beyond behind the meter, like wheeling. Are there any plans or discussions about allowing wheeling in the UAE, be it in Dubai or Abu Dhabi?
It comes up because you have customers who realize they have a potentially larger solar PV capability than they can satisfy at one site.
Exactly.
I mean, I think that takes you into potentially a very different form of market structure, frankly. And I can see why there's an understandable reluctance or hesitation to go too far down that route and open what might be seen as a bit of a Pandora's box. I mean, if it was restricted to a customer using their own energy on another site of their own, you know, that's more limited clearly than selling. But you can still get into some interesting definitional issues about what's a customer and what's another site. So I don't see that coming quickly, if I'm honest. I think there's probably still adequate scope for customers to use the on-site, you know, option and opportunity before you start to say, oh, we're now missing out on some huge opportunities. I think that'd be the case in Dubai anyway.
In Abu Dhabi?
Again, because we lack the market structures, there isn't transparency on the costs of access to the transmission system, the distribution system. So I think it's something that we are aware of, we're thinking about, and we're being challenged on. But we have a lot of work to do in other areas to support that, because you know, you can't create a policy for something like this in isolation of the rest of the system, or else you can find there are some significant unintended consequences that affect all other consumers on the system.
Yeah. Amro, can you reflect on DG in Saudi Arabia? What's the value of DG in Saudi Arabia? And are there discussions on net metering, net billing, wheeling?
So the regulator in Saudi Arabia, ICRA, has actually released a sort of provisional regulating document that should potentially govern the distributed generation deployment within the kingdom. This was released 2 years ago, and within that document, it explicitly stated that net metering is the mechanism that's going to be adopted. It governed systems up until 1 megawatt, and then there was some talk about whether it's 1 or 2 megawatts, but it's rather 1 or 2. Nobody knows exactly what the number is, because we have sort of two versions of this provisional document. There's still talks, significant amount of modeling, studies, analyses have been conducted, have been performed, and on a very big scale actually. So the impact of labor creation, employment, employees created, jobs created was assessed. Macro impact on the GDP, non-oil GDP was assessed. Impact on the grid. You know, when you deploy DG, many think that it's a rosy picture. It does have benefits, definitely. DG does bestow benefits upon the grid, but it also does come with its problems. So both costs and benefit of deploying DG within the kingdom was also assessed. It is still not, I would say, still in the planning phase because there's just so much associated with it. SEC, the Saudi electricity company, has to be prepared to absorb DG. Standards have to be set in order to dictate what are the regulating and technical constraints to govern imports and outputs, exports and imports of energy to and from the grid. Professionals have to be on site to make the connection. You can't allow anybody to connect the distributed system to the grid. So the status is, as of now, I would say that the studies have been made, the analysis has been conducted. It is now with policymakers to basically finalize the decision and just make the final cut on what the final details are, and hopefully we expect something good to happen in the near future, at least to allow DG to be deployed.
And I hope they make up their mind soon. I've received questions on Slido, but I think for the sake of time, I mean, are there any comments from the audience? Gauri, maybe you want to reflect on the discussion, if there are any comments from you, or maybe best practices from India, business models that can be applied here that were not... Is there a microphone?
Yeah, I think the discussion here was really good in terms of, what are the true costs of, bringing in renewables and the integration costs especially. And I think that is where we are looking at newer business models emerging, especially as you asked me from India. I think a couple of the things that we are seeing there is this whole issue around we still are a very low renewable system. And if we hit, the 220 gigawatt and possibly even the 400 plus gigawatt system, what will it take to stabilize the grid? So some of the ideas out there are that, we need to have, say, about 20 gigawatts of spinning reserves. We need to also look at how to bring in a mix of, we have the first utility scale storage, which has been piloted in Delhi, for instance, that has also come in. But also how to bring in gas into the system. We have an issue around gas in terms of utilization, that there's about 25 gigawatts, which is roughly stranded capacity. And how can that be deployed with this whole growth in renewables? So that is one, those are some of the things being talked about. The other thing which I think, Les, you had mentioned was this whole issue around bringing in energy service companies. And I think that's something which we've seen the growth of a lot in India, wherein you have the service, the ESCO, who is going to decide your solution as a commercial or industrial player in terms of, what mix of renewables, what mix of, buying from the spot market, what mix of getting, the conventional grid-based power in. And to me, the most interesting thing that happened in that sphere was that Petronas, actually, the national oil company of Malaysia, they spent $300 million in acquiring one of the largest ESCOs in India. And so to me, that was an interesting trend of, a big national oil company, wanting to enter the Indian renewable space and actually, and to me, that's energy transition in action, actually. That when you see big oil, big national oil companies taking large positions, to come in to buy into companies, $300 million is the order of a large, a medium-sized oil or gas development, right? And, the other example of, I would say, energy transition in action is when you have the national oil the erstwhile national oil company of Norway, Equinor, investing in offshore wind in India. So I think we're seeing a lot of, companies coming in. You have Total coming in also on the solar side, BP coming in on the solar and EV charging space in India. So I think we're seeing a lot of crisscrossing of across the energy value chain, which is happening. And to me, that is good news because it means there are deeper pockets looking to really, finance this sector beyond just the banking sector.
Yeah. And Masdar recently invested in a company in India as
Yes,
well. And that
yes,
goes to proving the
exactly.
maturity and credibility of the market,
Right.
being able to attract foreign
Absolutely,
investments.
yeah.
Any other comments, questions? I think I covered the question that I saw on Slido, but if there are any final comments from the audience? There is one in the back. Microphone, please.
Thanks very much. I thought the conversation this morning was great. I think we've been talking a lot at POIRI about the need to move away from LCOE and do some really granular, detailed modelling of power systems. And great to hear Amro and Les echoing that particularly. So one of the things that we've noticed recently, we've been updating our models. One of the big trends is a move towards bifacial and tracking on PV, and actually that makes the integration even more difficult because the ramping, it basically makes a nice curve a square, and the ramping requirement on the net generation is even more extreme. So I think that points to integration being the major challenge, or for us it's the major challenge to renewables now. I think, the developer expertise is there, the finance is there, the economics are there, and it's integration. One of my fears is that it's a 5 or 10 year journey. I think, it's going to be various different components need to be looked at. I'm just wondering how are, kind of maybe looking to Les and maybe Graham, if you, and I guess the whole panel, how are policymakers gearing up for that challenge? Because the danger, and we've seen a couple of kind of calls for consultancy services for large RFPs saying consultants come and fix this, make the system flexible. And I think you really need to break it up and look at the different aspects with coordination. I just wonder how are policymakers and regulators right now thinking about dealing with the integration challenge and the 5 or 10 year journey that we're going to have.
So you're saying bifacial will add to it? I mean, we discussed
it's just a point. It makes it. It's an interesting kind of trend. The trend towards bifacial makes integration. It's just an extra layer, an extra straw on the camel's back that makes it even more difficult. But the wider point is integration being the major challenge. How are policymakers kind of gearing up? What kind of working groups? What kind of cross kind of company coordination is there going to be?
I think the topic itself is relevant, but I know if bifacial adds in a different twist to it. You want to comment on that, Les?
Well, again, the PV2 tender for Abu Dhabi allows for bifacial PV. So it's not something we've done a lot of specific analysis on, but the challenge I think that you're referring to, Brendan, is that there is no one model that solves these problems. There are different levels, different granularities of model, different time domains that need to be looked at. And I think people are looking at, Plexos type models to do a least cost generation plan at the moment. And actually that's missing all of this ramp rate, all these transients on the system. And even if they go to a dispatch-based review, then they're not looking at the kind of the frequency-based disturbances that we're going to get in the system. And the challenge, I think, is, of course, consultants have a lot to add, but we need to build our in-house capabilities as well in this, and then continually be asking the consultants to bring us the best learning from Europe, from South America, from North America, and then to add that on, and then to increase our capacity and to run different types of models to cover all of the different elements that we're going to be challenged with on the future energy system. And also, you mentioned 5 to 10 years. I think 10 to 15 years is probably the minimum time period that we should think about doing this for. We should actually not be thinking about modeling our system for 2025 now. We should be thinking about 2035 and then working backwards, because only then will we future-proof our systems.
Hassan?
I think actually this takes you to a different domain a little, but by going there. You can see that the requirement for taking risk and venturing into new technologies, especially with a new developer and going out with the concept of the 1 cent target, it's became a requirement. I mean, you have your finance structure, your other part, and I see where that question is heading to. with all the respect, even if you go to Europe and try to acquire any other knowledge or experience, it's something new even to Europe. Going bifacial, going with all the new concept, going a little bit over the step to improve your LCOE, to improve your project cost, will lead to new issues, to new problems. How can we mitigate that? How can we look into that? I would say that's literally is a project risk that you have to emphasize on. It is a requirement to head into that way. As has been mentioned before, going business as usual will not lead you there. You are really limited to your project cost structure. You have your finance cost is something that's really goes up with the market change. Your cost of material keeps in declining, but nevertheless, it will not help you achieve the target that you are looking for. So going ahead with these risks, bifacial is one of them. And by the way, bifacial comes with a big package of risk that comes with it, that the industry is just recently identifying. Now, how to tackle that from the client, from the off-taker point of view, I really think they have not looked at it. I'm being very frank, and I'm being a developer, and we're going into this area. It's a risk required. It's an area that we have to venture into. Battery is something that large-scale battery deployment, storage is one of these areas. But what will that reflect? How a step over need to be done in case of risk, in case of effect on spinning reserve requirement or penetration to the grid. These things need to be tackled as we go, I would say.
All right, for the sake of time, I want to just close with a quick poll with our panelists. Do you think we will see a 1.0, a 1 cent kilowatt hour from solar projects in the region the next 3 years? Less?
I think we'll get close in the next 3 years, but going forwards in the next 10 years, quite possibly.
You give it a 10, Hassan?
I would say we may go below. I would say
in 3 years.
I would say that by that time there's really no value in the energy cost itself. The value is really in the operation of the energy more than the energy itself.
The utilization.
So it looks like this.
Yeah, Amro?
I think we would, but I'm skeptical about its profitability and bankability.
Graham?
Well, we've taken 3.5 cents out in a relatively short period of time. I think you'd be a brave person who'd say that taking that extra half cent out is beyond the realms of possibility. I expect so. Yeah.
All right. Please join me in thanking our panelists. And I'll give it back to Michaela. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much to our moderator and speakers. Now it's time for a quick 15 minutes break just to refill our levels of energy with some coffee. And please join us back within the following 15 minutes and we'll start with our next panel. Thank you very much.